Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this important webinar discussion hosted by All Rise under the theme Defending the Defenders. My name is Simphiwe Sidu, and I work as the Regional Legal Advisor for the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, and I will also be a facilitator for today. On the evening of 22 October 2020, many of us learned with sadness of the tragic passing of Joyce Fikile Ntshangase, who we all have come to know as Mam Fikile Ntshangase or Fikile Ntshangase. Mam Ntshangase was the vice chairperson of a subcommittee of the Mfolozi Community Environmental Justice Organization that we also know as Mqejo. For many years, Mqejo has been challenging the further expansion of a large coal mine at Somkhele in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa by Tendele Coal Mining. As a community member of Somkhele and also a woman human rights defender, Mam Ntshangase played an instrumental role in fighting for the rights of those affected and resisting against any inducements that the mining company and some authorities wanted to provide to community members to surrender their ancestral land. Even when tensions grew within the community, with the mining company and authorities causing divisions amongst members of the community with financial inducements and promises of jobs, Mam Ntshangase never backed down, and she was committed to fighting for the interests of everyone. On 22 October 2020, at around 6:30, and while she was preparing dinner for her family, a group of unknown men arrived and shot her several times in her living room. Mam Ntshangase unfortunately died on the scene. She was 63 years old at the time of her death, and she left behind her daughter, Malungelo, and her two beautiful grandsons. To a date, no arrests have been made. Mam Ntshangase was a campaigner, a leader, and a woman human rights defender. Most importantly, she was a neighbor, a friend, mother, and also a grandmother to two grandsons. Today, we commemorate her life and honor her legacy, and we continue to demand for her justice. Before we will officially start with the program, I will just ask us to observe just a few moments of silence in honor of Mam Fikile Ntsangase's life. Thank you very much, everyone, for that. It is much appreciated. Right now, I will ask Kath to assist me with playing a video. And a huge thanks to Global Witness for documenting the story and ensuring that Mam Ntsangase's legacy lives on, and we continue to increase her visibility.
My mom would receive anonymous calls, like from unknown numbers, and people would tell her that her day is coming. My mom was murdered on the 22nd of October in 2020. If I was home, I would have tried to do something, and then my son would have lost both my mother and I on that very same day. Before the mine talks were surrounding the community, we were a united community. We were happy, we were free to walk wherever you wanted to walk. You could be friends with anyone that you wanted to be friends with. It was a nice united community before.
It has changed drastically because since the mining was here, even the community was split into so many parts. We are not the same as we are living before the mine arrived here.
Fisa nje ukubalula ekhaya lami la. Fisa nje ukuthi ngibele ekhaya ngingasuki. Ngoba ngesikhathi ngingakhala ezindlu bese ngithi ngenzela ukuthi izingane zami noma ngabe ngithathwa inhloboni yokwenza. Ufuna izingane zami ngingayishiyi phandle.
You see how the wind is blowing. What if there's a mine here? How am I going to survive with my children?
Communities should expose such things and should be able to talk to each other about such things. Educating our people enough about the environment, about their health, about the mining industry is important before you sign on that paper, on that contract that you are willing to leave your land or that you are willing to relocate.
Umama omnandi man. Wayemnandi ngendlela wayemnandi ngayo umama Ntshangase. Kubuya isithukuthezi esikhulu mangabe nikufika lapho kukhulunywa khona. Kwasho ukuthi ube mabhabhe esukuma ehlale efuna ukwazi izinto.
If she says something, she won't going to be changed. She will stand for it and focus on it and fight for it.
After my mom's murder, community members are mostly scared. We are afraid to even ask questions at a meeting about electricity, at a meeting about water, at a meeting about schools, because you don't know what might cause you to be a target. I don't believe that my mom's murder should cause us to be silent. I don't think her legacy will live on if we live like that. I think she wouldn't have wanted us to just give up. So whatever that I can do to assist, especially the youth of my community, I think I'm going to give it my 100%. But I am going to take on a fight. If I was to move, I was going to move right away after her murder, but I chose to stay because I want to see how this whole thing works out and how much information can I gather in order to save my community.
Thank you very much for that, Kath. And once again, a huge thank you as well to our colleagues from Global Witness. So before I think we move right along to having the discussions for today under the theme Defend the Defenders, I would just like to note a few things to also our participants who have joined us today. Please feel free to use your social media platforms to just live tweet or just provide any information about the discussions we're having today under the hashtags Defend the Defenders and Justice for Fikile as well. I will move on to introducing the panelists that are joining us for today. We have Kirsten Youens, who is the environmental justice lawyer and the founder and executive director at All Rise Attorneys for Climate Justice. She's also the legal representatives for Mqejo. And then we also have Mary Haas, who is an interventionist, human rights worker, and violence monitor in KZN, South Africa. And we also have Arnold Tsunga, who is currently the chairperson of the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, and also the country director for the National Democratic Institute in Zimbabwe. We are also joined by Louis Wilson, who is the senior communications advisor at Global Witness. And later on, we'll also be joined by Mary Lawlor, who is currently the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defender, as well as the founder of Frontline Defenders. And lastly, we are joined by Dr. Rowan Williams, who is the trustee for Inspire Dialogue Foundation, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and also a retired master of Magdalene College at Cambridge University. To participants, please feel free to, at the end of the session, in the last 10 minutes of our discussion, what we will do is we will have a question and answer session. So during the presentations, please feel free to drop in any questions that you have in the chat box, and then we will take notes of them and we will direct them to the panelists. If you would like to address your question to a specific panelist, please also feel free to do so. So what I'll ask is that when you drop in your question in the chat box, you change your settings to just address it to everyone so that all of us will be able to see the question that is being posed. So without wasting any further time, I will start and hand over to Kirsten Youens. Kirsten, thank you very much, firstly, for hosting this important webinar discussion where we remember the life and legacy of Fikile Ntshangase. And I will ask you to just provide us with your presentation on how we can use the law to defend environmental defenders in the context of mining affected community, especially the Mqejo community, in which Fikile Ntshangase was the deputy chairperson of the subcommittee in Somkhele. Thank you very much, Kirsten, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Simphiwe, and thank you to all our wonderful panelists that have joined us today. As well as all the participants, we've got such a wonderful group of people here. So many of the people have been part of this process since the beginning, supporting me and supporting Mqejo. So it's really special that we're all here as we commemorate Fikile, as well as so many other environmental defenders in the world who lost their lives in 2020. I'm an environmental defender. I've been an environmental defender my whole life, but I've been an environmental lawyer for 21 years and an environmental justice lawyer for, about 6 years, since I started working with Umfolozi Community Environmental Justice Organization, or as we call them, Mqejo. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be on this platform. It's a very important one. So I'd like to start this webinar by talking about the work that I do for the community you saw in the video. Malungelo, who has taken on the fight on behalf of her mum, as well as the other Mqejo defenders that you saw, and the 3,000 more. As an environmental defender and as a mother, the passion that drives me every day is ensuring the environment is protected for future generations. But as an environmental justice lawyer, I am responsible for defending people like Mam Ntshangase and the rest of the Mqejo members. And South Africa has one of the best constitutions in the world. Our Bill of Rights is a powerful act that encompasses right to life, equality, right to food, water, and housing, and the right to an environment that is not harmful to one's health or well-being. The challenge lies in being able to enforce those rights. And this particular case has been a very challenging one. It's been fraught with difficulty right from the start. I was first invited to speak with the Somkele people in around 2016. Before that, I'd been working with the Fuleni Nklejo community, also opposing coal mining. And in 2016, when I went to work in Somkele, I was faced with a very fractured community, a community where coal mining had been taking place since 2007, and it had already caused the divisions and the difficulties that coal mining in community areas is very well known for. So from that point of view, it was hard to start on a project where there was a current coal mine. It's a huge case. We instituted 2 court cases over 2017 and 2018. And although the court cases are complicated enough on their own, I think for me, what was exceptionally difficult was the emotional toll that was evidenced in the people and my clients that I was working for. So my job is to do the best for my clients as far as the law is concerned. But the more involved I became with the community and the more time I spent in the community, the more personal it became. So, you know, for a community such as this one, it's not just about the difficulty in living next to an open cast coal mine where respiratory illnesses are an issue, where noise and dust and blasting is an issue, where water pollution is an issue. But there's a strong psychological aspect to everything that I noticed and still do. The effect, the psychological effect of not having the power to challenge what is coming your way. So being told that you have to move off your land and not being able to do anything about it, or not understanding your rights enough to be able to stand up for the powers that be. It's a very almost degrading on the human psyche. And what I spent a lot of time doing in the beginning was educating people about their rights. And unfortunately, what happens when environmental impact assessment practitioners, for example, or mining officials or government officials go into a community to say there's development coming, you know, a mine's moving in, they just tell people what's going to happen. They don't explain what their rights are and what they can do during the process. So we spent a lot of time explaining the law, explaining environmental rights, explaining environmental impact assessment processes, explaining the mining law, free, prior and informed consent, land rights, and the ability to explaining the Constitution and the fact that we do have a Constitution and we have a Bill of Rights. And that immediately empowered and galvanized people and uplifted people, just that knowledge and the fact that there was now somebody in their corner using the law to protect them. So that was the first hurdle to overcome, was just to explain and help educate people about their rights. Some of the things that we had to sort of overcome along the way was the fact that I don't speak isiZulu, unfortunately, and all my clients are isiZulu speakers. So a lot of the time we had to deal with translations and explaining law and understanding law in a different language. Also, my clients are spread out over large areas. So, and there's no smartphones necessarily. Data is always a problem. We can't have Zoom calls. So when we meet with clients, we drive up there and we organize big community meetings, and it's spread out over large areas. So logistically, things like that become just meeting with your clients is not a simple Zoom call like this. It's complicated. It got particularly complicated during COVID, and when the security risks arose. And that did happen. I mean, this case has gone on for many years, and the security and the threats and the violence have increased substantially over time. It got particularly bad last year. I mean, before last year, there was definitely intimidation, letters sent out by mine management suggesting that certain people were holding the mine to ransom, that people were going to lose their jobs if the court cases with these individuals named in the letters continued. And so certain people would be victimized and certain people would be intimidated and threatened. And we had some public meetings where pro-mining activists would throw rocks on the roofs and try and lock us in and that kind of thing. But last year, during our South African COVID hard lockdown, was when things escalated quite dramatically. And it started with one of our activists being attacked in his home. He was called by name and held up at gunpoint, attacked. He denied being who they were looking for, and it was scary. I had to get special permits to travel during COVID and take him and his family to a place of safety. And then we had another client who during the night there was a drive-by shooting and a hail of bullets through her windows and her walls. And then we had a lot of death threats. Myself, I haven't had death threats, but there's been a lot of intimidation tactics used on me specifically. Lots of smearing of my name in the profession and in public. And naming me as specifically somebody who has a personal vendetta to close down the mine. And I think, aside from, the security issues were bad then, but when Fikile was murdered, we had to then move our meetings to far off places. We couldn't have them in the community anymore. We had to have strict security protocols in place so that people were safe. Crazy things like learning how to park your car in a certain way to escape more easily if there was a problem. And frontline defenders was incredible. Southern African human rights defenders were amazing in keeping the community safe, but us as well. So the needs of our clients has come first, and it takes quite an emotional toll. The violence and the intimidation continues. It will continue until this matter is resolved. And I think we must all know that environmental defenders have the right to be protected and the right to protest, which they did this morning. Our Mteja members went and protested at the local police station demanding justice. They have the right to justice and accountability. And I think we at All Rise do our very best to make sure that happens. And the work that Fikile did will continue with the rest of the brave activists from Mteja defenders. But we haven't. Justice has not been done yet, and I hope both in the court cases and in finding Fikile's murderers that does ultimately happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, for that. And if anything, I think, also have to give a big thank you to All Rise for the role that it has played throughout this mining dispute to assist the communities in Somkhele. Next, we will have Mary de Haas, who will provide us with an overview of problems in protecting environmental defenders and strategies to counter this. So we'll look at it both at community level and also through networks, both that operate nationally and internationally. So Mary, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Simphiwe. Can you hear me? I did unmute, didn't I? Yes, good. Okay. I just want to say that this is something, the discussion I hope will carry forward. We want to do this. We want to keep honoring Mam Ntshangase, and this is why I'm here. Look, I first want to just explain very briefly why justice is so difficult to get for Mama Ntshangase. I don't think people realize just what a crisis we are in governance in this country. And nowhere is it worse than in policing. As Kirsten said, we've got a wonderful constitution. I deal with a lot of human rights problems, and I can tell you, we can't get the constitution implemented, whether it's health, whether it's land, and policing worst of all. Now, the problem with policing started in '94, but it got much worse with the Zuma years. Basically, the police are politicized. And after 2009, with the appointment of Clearly as commissioner, things just lurched from bad to worse. Policing is all sorts of wrong people put in management, not even policemen, some of them. Corruption reigned, intelligence structures absolutely decimated. And according to a recently leaked report, our intelligence structures in this province have apartheid era operatives who have a project to sow dissension and kill people, to divide the province. That's how bad it is. The minister does nothing. It can get a lot worse because the minister wants the commissioner out. The commissioner is the first professional policeman for 20 years almost. He's made a difference already. Clearly already controls half the police, intelligence people. What the man who's investigating political violence reports to Clearly. Now, I mean, how can you have a united, cohesive police service with this interference? And if Clearly has his way, the commissioner will go, and then we really are in trouble. Okay, so politics, as I looked at the latest statistics for political killing this morning, I thought, yeah, it's all the ANC government. If there's one blame here for all this violence, it is the ANC government, both by acts of omission and commission. Right, and I want the world to know that. That's why I'm saying it. Now, rural areas, I mean, we are an abnormally violent society because of, and it's not just police, even the Justice Department, even the prosecuting service is a problem, and some of the magistrates are problems because of the way they were appointed. So that's why we don't have justice for Mama Ntshangase yet, because the other thing is, with the almost deliberate weakening of the police and the growth of private security companies, which are a problem, not properly regulated, the police don't even have the type of monitoring equipment that the sophisticated security companies have. So the hitmen, and I've been monitoring this since the 90s, training in rural areas, government doing nothing, guns, awash with guns, so the hitmen are linked to the taxi industry. The government has absolutely no will to deal with the taxi industry, and they're pals with them. They have taxi interests, right? So when the hitman strikes, he disappears, and he's using an unregistered SIM card, so the police can't trace him. So this is the story of most killings in South Africa, organized by shadowy forces. In this case, people obviously supporting mining somewhere, and facilitated by easy access to hitmen and guns. And the government has been warned for years about this, and they've done nothing. So what do we do about it? Okay, we start, I think, with the local community. I tell people this: do your own intelligence work, document what's happening in your area. Now, of course, the problem, as Kirsten has said, is that people, the communities are divided. So what you need to do in your own little neighborhood is people you trust, neighbors, watch, have a series in the urban areas. People are involved in community police forums, they do patrols. That's not feasible. I don't know, I want to throw it up whether it's possible for any MCGO member to be part of a community police forum, just to keep an eye on what they're doing. And that way you can support the police that are helpful and expose the corrupt. The police, unfortunately, you have another problem in rural areas, and that is they tend to take the side of the traditional leaders. And they of course, are the problem, because they get bought off by the mines. Okay, that's a normal thing. So I'm saying a sort of neighborhood watch system. they have my phone numbers, but they must have a number of phone numbers. We must all have numbers of the duty officer, the police commissioner at the station, even the area commissioner, so that any sign, even shooting, people must document all this. If they hear gunshots at night, they must immediately notify us. If they have threats, they must notify us. We must have a network, because if I'm not around, somebody else must phone the police. We must organize locally for protection. Okay, documentation of the violence. Gunshots tonight. What sort of guns were they? Right, now, the problem is the roads are bad and the policing are split down the middle in this country. Some of them following clearly Zuma, and some of them, as they should, the National Commission. So we've got to identify the policemen that are helping men and women. Now, we can't stop with the police. Now, what I want everybody to do is we need to bombard, not just when the police are not responding, we go to the district commissioner, but we go to the provincial people, we go to national people, we go to the parliamentary committees. It's absolutely clear to me Parliament is not doing its oversight. We can discuss how we do it in another forum, because I've got to dash through this. Okay, but we use that. We also now go for the Minister of Land Affairs. She has been instructed in this recent court judgment with the Ingonyama Trust. She's been told she's not doing her job to protect people's land rights. Now, it's no use giving them PTOs if they're going to get killed staying on their land. That judgment is very, very clear that only people on the land have the right to alienate it. Now we have a problem, because the judgment didn't deal specifically with business leases, mining leases, but the principles obtained. Those leases were got without, in one area I work in, people didn't even know about it. They weren't given permission. The Ingonyama Trust was not given permission by those landowners to give the lease to the mine. Now, that's something we need to look at, the legal implications of how we can enforce that. The mine has been given a lease on people's land to run a mine without people actually saying to the Ingonyama Trust, you may do that. Now, we've got to hammer the minister about these issues. What is she going to do to make sure people can enjoy those rights? She's got to report back to the court. What we've also got to do is sell this idea to her that this land 40 years ago was earmarked for agricultural development, irrigation. We've got to go back there and convince her and the Minister for the Environment that we want agriculture, we use global warming, we use water shortage, we want agriculture and tourism, because that's where the jobs come. So that's the other issue we've got to work on. But she must also, as a Minister of Land Affairs, push her policing minister, justice minister, because we must also involve justice in this, because they're the ones that have allowed this traditional Khoisan leaders bill to be passed. And there's another alert, please, for lawyers and others, because in terms of legislation that they want to pass, like the upstream petroleum resources bill, it's taking land rights away, that people's land can be alienated without them knowing it. And the traditional leaders, in terms of the Khoisan bill, can now enter into business partnerships without people knowing it. So we're back to square one with the land alienated without their knowing it. So we have to be alert to that. Okay, so we also have to go for COPTA, comparative, the people who oversee traditional authorities. Because when the chiefs, the Izinduna, are threatening people, as they have done, Kirsten has the affidavits, we go to them and say, listen, you are supposed to make sure these people behave and follow the law. We want audits done of their accounts. What monies are coming into those traditional authorities? They're part of the problem, and we have to expose them and get to do their jobs properly. So what I'm saying to you, running through this, because I don't want to go over time, what I'm saying to you is that we need to network among ourselves with this. The other person we've got to go for with all of this is the Environmental Minister. She make a lot of noise at the moment about, oh, we've got to do something about global warming. Well, let's try and hold it to it. But I think she doesn't have much power relative to the mining sector of our government. I just want to say to you, our government is just totally dysfunctional. It doesn't even have proper administrative structures. I mean, the Minister of Land Affairs is supposed to have administrative structures for these to deal with the problem with the leases. She doesn't have them, and they're malfunctioning. That's why people don't have water. So we also have to push the Minister of the Environment about, we cannot allow this land, which is part of preserving our biodiversity, linked to the wilderness area, linked to the game reserves. She's got to do her bit to try and restore some sort of environmental balance in that area, because humans and the environment are one and the same thing. They need a clean environment. Now, this is a tall order, because when I started this, I thought, well, but otherwise you sit back in despair, as I'm starting to do a lot of the time, because you feel completely powerless. We have to empower the local community, but to do that, we have to be there. We have to be there for them. I think we must start with a very informal working group among ourselves to actually find ways of helping to empower the local community to give us regular feedback about issues. And then we can work on the piece in the government. I think I better stop, because I think I'm out of time by now.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that presentation and highlighting also the systemic failures, of the various arms of government, and yes, finding ways of how we can strategize also at community level. Thank you very much for that. I'll move on to Arnold Tsunga. Hi, Arnold. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, I just want to check if Arnold. Hi, Arnold. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you a lot for joining us. And what I will do, I'll ask you to touch on how we can protect environmental defenders. And in doing so, just examining the increase of violence against environmental defenders working within the extractive industries across the Southern African region. But before I officially ask you to come in, I will ask Kat to play a brief video, and then you can speak right after that. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Simphiwe. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think the starting point is to express my sincere appreciation to All Rise, Kirsten and your team, for organizing this memorial celebration for the works of Fikile Ntshangase, who was murdered just about less than 2 hours away from now, last year. So she was already approaching the last days of her life and paying the price with her own life for defending the rights of others. I'm very proud to be part of this event. I'm going to put earphones on because there's a bit of feedback. And then let me explain the video. That video, essentially, it arose sometime last month in Zimbabwe, and it shows the work of so-called investors in some rural area in Zimbabwe. I believe it's an area called Mutoko, where we have granite rock material that is then shaped to constitute granite rocks that are then exported. I understand on that video that those are Chinese investors who were given mining rights within a rural community. So you can see that part of their process of extraction of value was to put explosives and then detonate them from the ground in order to break the ground as well as to break the stones. But what was very clear is that explosive devices were used within a community, and that the rocks and boulders that emerged from that explosion rolled themselves down to a point where they then destroyed the homes of the rural communities. And you could hear the kids from that community who were saying, Matombo, they're speaking a local language, Shona. Matombo, it's a rock. And towards the end, when one of the boulders hit against the rural home and destroyed it, and then you then saw the livestock running away from once the kitchen was impacted by the stones, and so the livestock fled in fear. But then the kids, one of them shouted, "Imbaya Gogoya Paziwa." In Shona, that means my grandmother's house has been destroyed. And so the investor, these are called investors, they got those rights to mining those pieces of land. And if you were to try and investigate Kirsten as a lawyer to say, how did these people get involved and they're doing this explosive in that type of community, you will find that they will say, in fact, that there was an environmental impact assessment, and that the environmental impact assessment will have shown that it was safe to do those types of mining. If you ask whether there was informed consent, they will be able to produce some form of documents that show that someone was able to confirm that, in fact, the rural community gave prior and informed consent before that type of mining happened. So that's really the experience of the rural communities who find themselves sitting on what are deemed to be mineral resources. And that is the life that is going to be experienced by so many people across Southern Africa. And that's the degree of powerlessness that communities have in order to look after their own grazing land, their ancestral land, and to be able to bring up their children in dignity. You spoke, Kirsten, about the question of the link between the failure to get people involved in giving informed consent with an attack on dignity. And I think you could not have been more correct than that. And I think it's off to people like you who, as professionals, can be able to apply your professional to make a lot of money in commercial practice, but that you devote your energy and your time and professional capabilities to align your skills and try to give the people a chance to have a small say in their own enterprise about their own living environment and to preserve the little dignity that they have. But I don't see how taking away a house from families and making them homeless under the guise of creating employment, under the guise of creating international, forex or international trade. There's a big issue about the psyche of our leaders and their failure to appreciate the primary responsibility that they have to use the control of government, the control of the arms of the state, and make politics a resource that helps to unlock the potential of our people rather than to destroy their lives and livelihood. So I just wanted to start on that point and say that with increasingly ineffectual and a weakening multilateral system, our United Nations system and our international rule of law framework, is probably at its weakest since the Second World War, because the Second World War shocked humanity and people into understanding that if you don't have the rule of law, if you don't have right is might, you run a risk that as a humanity we can get into a spiral of conflict that can be so devastating, that can be so barbaric to humanity. But then once we built this international rule of law framework, the international human rights instruments and the covenants that are binding on the states around the right to the environment, around fundamental human rights, which we have now codified, Kirsten, as you say, into our constitutions, which basically defines the minimum relationship between those who govern and those who are governed. Once the people that are given the authority to run states no longer defend the rule of law, no longer use separation of powers and institutions of government to protect the weakest and the most vulnerable in our societies, it usually creates a basis for conflict and instability. And a number of countries in Africa are facing very strong conflict and instability as a result, as I say, of these structural causes that are embedded in unfairness, in injustice, in inequality, and greed, in particular greed for those in power, working in collusion with very powerful non-state actors. In fact, let me say that non-state actors have become increasingly influential in shaping the way of life in our societies. They shape our electoral democracy. They buy political parties and politicians. They sponsor candidates. They control the economy. They are involved in the natural resource governance. And all in that process, they become more powerful in some instances than the state. So the concept of state capture, which is very popular in South Africa in a negative sense, because of the fact that we have had a situation of how the inability of the state to be strong as an institution and to be free from the influence of interests, economic interests, political interests, it makes the state weak and unable to protect its own citizens. And so I think the other factor is the structure of our economic model, which we inherited from the colonial system, where extractivism was a big piece of the economic model during the colonial era. And that was maybe understandable, though not necessarily excusable, in that the idea was to use colonial conquests to be able to make the flows of income move to countries that were seen as the colonial masters. But in the process, what the prospects of independence brought in Africa was a situation where we would then have expected that the control of the state, the control of the government apparatus and the policy-making function by the post-liberation African governments would result in a situation where the economic decisions would move more and more away from extractive economic relationships into situations where there can be value addition, where there can be more beneficiation, so that communities who live in areas where there's natural wealth can benefit from that wealth. If you look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union, you will find that it is a principle and value of the African Union that the governance architecture of the African Union, besides entrenching good governance, besides protecting human rights and the rule of law, they specifically also say that the African economic model must be such that the people who live on these resources must be beneficiaries to avoid a situation where resources become a curse to our communities. And the reliance on fossil fuel, it's a heavy reliance on fossil fuel, which brings this dilemma of the mining and energy mix or matrix, where mining contributes towards production of energy. So the Fikile Ntshangase environment, where there's huge mining by the Tendele company. It's a feature that happens across the whole of Southern Africa. In Mozambique, it's Tete, where you also have huge deposits of coal. In Zimbabwe, it's in Hwange area, where you've got huge deposits of coal. But each time you find that there's mining that is then meant to produce energy, which is fossil energy, there's always the danger of huge mass evictions, the blasting of the land, a lot of carbon and a lot of dust pervading the environment, a destruction of the environment, and contribution towards a climate disaster as a result of the type of energy that we go for. So I think land, environmental, and indigenous defenders, they are going to be under increasing pressure. The COVID lockdown measures, which have worsened the excess of evil confronting human rights defenders, because whilst we are celebrating Mama Fikile's bravery and fighting spirit, we predict an escalation in attacks on human rights defenders across the whole of Southern Africa, unfortunately. And we are not building better. If anything, we are beginning to see leaders competing to mortgage the natural resources of African societies to investors, to financial lenders, sometimes to foreign governments under the guise of leveraging the natural resources for developmental purposes. So when you have a development which works in the minds of politicians, but is a ton of destruction on the local communities, and the communities have no voice. That's why we need people like Kirsten as lawyers to be really applying their minds to the situation. Maybe I think Simphiwe, I'm supposed to be coming to an end. Agreed? Yes. So let me say that I saw the figures. Frontline gave in their global report that 331 human rights defenders paid with their lives in defending the rights of others. And of those numbers, 70% were land, environment, and indigenous human rights defenders. There is a problem we have in our region. We underreport, I think we underdocument, we underinvestigate, and we underdefend. And so the nexus between conflict and extractive economy, we don't investigate it enough. We need to improve our monitoring and documentation in this area. And one of the concerns that we have as a network is that many of these human rights defenders, these people who fight these valiant fights to defend their own dignity, they are not aware that they are human rights defenders. They are not conscious, because for them it's a natural defense for their own survival. And because they don't know that they're human rights defenders, they therefore don't benefit from the protection mechanisms that are available. So the lack of knowledge translates very quickly into the increase in risk profile, and they become sitting ducks. So I think we need to redouble our awareness campaigns so that we don't leave anyone behind. So in ending, Kirsten was very correct that the South African Constitution provides for protection of the environment. And if you do an analysis of the major constitutions in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and others, you see that the embedding of the right to an environment that is not harmful to the wealth and well-being of African people, to an environment that is protected and that is protected for the benefit of present and future generation through legislative and other measures, is a requirement for all our governments. So I really think in celebrating Fikile, there's nothing more we can do other than to redouble our efforts to put pressure on governments to ensure that they can comply with their obligations to protect human rights. I'm going to end there and maybe talk about specific cases in Mozambique and other cases where we have had killings of defenders. And the central pillar there is that the killing has been with impunity, in that people get killed, there's no proper investigation, there's no one who's held to account, and there's impunity for the perpetrators and no remedies for the victims. And impunity will breed impunity as long as we operate on that mode. Thank you very much, Simphiwe.
Thank you so much for that, Arnold. So what I think I will do, I will ask Louis to just quickly come in and let us know about the discussion, the report that was released by Global Witness. And then thereafter, I will ask Mary Lola to come in.
Thank you, Simphiwe, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today, and most especially to our hosts, All Rise. This day, as others have noted, is of course a sad one, but also it's one that we at Global Witness hope can bring a little light. Fikile left a legacy of leadership, to be sure, and has inspired countless people around the world. The movement that Fikile was a member of, and indeed a leader of, is getting stronger for sure, thanks to her. But the same forces that killed Fikile are taking the lives of defenders every day around the world. We at Global Witness have been monitoring attacks against land and environmental defenders for nearly a decade now. And in that time, we've seen a really grim trend emerge. As the climate crisis intensifies, so too does violence against defenders of the earth, people like Fikile. And it tells us that the climate crisis is truly a crisis against humanity. Last year, our data shows that 227 environmental defenders were murdered in standing up for their land, for our planet, against climate breakdown and against resource exploitation. It's a shocking number, and we're just days away from the beginning of COP26, the biggest climate negotiations in history that will make or break the next decade, and perhaps much longer than that in terms of our livable planet. And yet defenders like Fikile, even when we see the numbers that we saw last year, are being sidelined. There's very little presence of grassroots activists, indigenous activists, or land and environmental defenders. Instead, what you see is that corporates, who are at the heart of this climate crisis, some of the biggest polluters, are being given a seat at the table, whether it's through sponsorship, invitations to speak, to help set the agenda. And we're missing the voices of activists like Fikile, the voices of organizations like All Rise, who are quietly doing the work that we all desperately need to do in order to defend people and our planet. And yet some of the worst polluters, companies who've mastered the art of greenwashing without actually changing their business model, have been allowed to sponsor climate negotiations, which to me is still quite an odd thing to be able to do. How can you sponsor as a company a climate negotiation? What does that mean, especially as a polluter? We're hosting events at COP26 with titles like Changing Consumer Behavior whilst people are murdered for defending the environment whilst the planet burns. We know that the supply chains that businesses profit from are causing death and destruction. 1/3 of the attacks that we recorded last year were directly linked to resource exploitation, logging, mining, as in the case of Fikile, and large-scale agribusiness were the worst sectors, the worst implicated sectors. And that figure is likely to be higher because often the true reason behind an attack is not recorded, whether it's because of intimidation, closed civil space, etc. And we can see that there are cases like Fikile's happening all around the world all the time. 4 defenders a week at least have been murdered since we signed the Paris Accords. And these cases are all connected by these same forces that are driving the climate crisis. The good news is that concerted international action, strong legislation, which regulates corporate behavior, can go a long way to making defenders safer. We know that. We really urgently need to change our collective definition of corporate accountability. Currently, corporations, as Arnold touched on, are never held liable for their immediate impacts on the environment and on people. It takes brave activists, it takes lawyers like Kirsten to hold them accountable for human rights abuses or environmental disasters. We need to go beyond even that. So business needs to be held accountable for their broader impacts, for the conditions that they create, for the pressure that they put on ecosystems and on communities like the one in Simphiwe. Without that, defenders will continue to face violence and persecution. And without protecting defenders, it's clear that the climate crisis will continue to spiral out of control. Defenders like Fikile are our last line of defense against climate breakdown. And I think we can all take heart from the fact that even after decades of violence, after 227 murders last year, people continue to stand up for their land for our collective natural environment. And I think in every story of defiance against corporate land grabbing, against deadly pollution, against environmental disasters, there is hope that we can turn the tide on the climate crisis and that we can learn to live in harmony with the natural world. I think it's clear from this case, from countless others, that until we do that, the violence will continue. So thank you very much to everybody, to our host today, to Simphiwe, to Kirsten, to Rowan, to Mary, and thank you most of all to Fikile.
Thank you so much, Louis, for that, and just reminding us of the different strategies we would need to employ to protect not only human rights defenders, but also just to advocate for climate justice and protect the world. We are now officially joined by Mary Lawlor, who is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Mary, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I will ask you to just please touch on the global issue in terms of the violence against defenders, of whom Fikile Ntshangase was one, and the main challenges for environmental defenders that they're facing in terms of protecting their rights, and also providing us with any solutions in terms of that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and it is lovely to be here again. Sorry I couldn't join you earlier. In March this year, I presented my report to the Human Rights Council on the killings of human rights defenders and the threats that can so often precede them. In its opening paragraph, I highlight the death of Fikile. And Fikile's murder is demonstrative, as we've heard, of a global trend where human rights defenders, and in particular environmental defenders, are threatened and killed for their work. It's a sad irony that those who do so much to protect life on our planet are the ones whose lives are most at risk. Threats that often precede killings can be direct or indirect. They are intended to silence, intimidate, neutralize, and stop the work of human rights defenders from carrying out their legitimate work. There is no more direct attack on civil society space than the killing of human rights defenders, and in my view, it is a red line that states should adopt as a red line which should never be crossed. Some states and businesses think that by killing human rights defenders, their problems will go away. Events like this make sure that that won't happen. Fikile's work lives on. And one thing I've learned over the last 20 months of the mandate is states really, really care about their reputation, and they will do anything to stop public attention, media attention, and they hate being called out for abuses they commit. So well-orchestrated advocacy campaigns put pressure on states to conduct full investigations into attacks and murders. Lack of investigation, as we all know, leads to impunity. And impunity is a key driver for more murder. States should not only end impunity, but also publicly applaud the legitimate work and the valuable contribution that human rights defenders make to build civil and just societies based on the rule of law. I wrote to the South African government and Tendele Coal Mining Limited last December in Fikile's case, and they have still not responded to me. How can I trust that South Africa supports the work of human rights defenders or takes the climate crisis seriously if it is not willing to address such a serious issue? During South Africa's last Universal Periodic Review in 2017, it refused to accept recommendations from other UN member states to stop violations caused by business activity. South Africa received 3 recommendations on the subject. It turned down advice to introduce regulation to ensure that companies comply with international human rights standards, and it refused to hold companies to account for human rights and environmental violations that they commit. And in such circumstances, I can't help but feel that Fikile's death may have been preventable. Enforcing environmental standards, adequate consultation, and the free, prior, and informed consent of local communities, reduces the likelihood of division and conflict among affected communities. Refusing to hold companies to account for violations they commit makes South Africa complicit in these violations. As I said, one simple first step that states can make is to publicly applaud the work of human rights defenders, recognize it, give it a legitimacy, and give it credibility. Another is setting robust protection mechanisms for human rights defenders who do come under attack. Businesses must abide by the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights to ensure that their activities don't directly or indirectly cause human rights violations. And I just should say that I've come from a press conference on the Aarhus Convention that have just set up a rapid response mechanism, the state parties, as of yesterday, to have a special rapporteur on environmental defenders. And we know also about moves at the EU, where there is going to be an EU directive, which will be mandatory on human and environmental due diligence coming by probably the end of the year. In November, I think the first bit is being published. Only last June, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights presented guidance to the UN Human Rights Council on how to protect human rights defenders. And they say, if a business enterprise is causing or contributing to human rights abuse affecting defenders, their responsibility is clear-cut. They need to end the abuse and address any harm that has occurred. Human rights defenders are uniquely placed often to warn of potential risks of business activities, including of violence, corruption, and criminalization. Yes, they are rarely consulted. Individuals often become defenders because they feel compelled to do so. The climate crisis is one factor forcing many into the role of human rights defender. This should present itself as an opportunity, not a threat, for states and business to tackle the most urgent issues of our time. Human rights defenders have valuable experience and expertise gained from years and years of experience working with communities or on the front line of environmental catastrophes, and only with a greater understanding of the work and potential contribution of human rights defenders and measures in place to protect them can we reduce the attacks against them. So I just think that, you know, we're all together in this. We collectively, we are all agents of change and pushing for a more civilized society based on the rule of law and more protection for environmental defenders. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. And if anything, I think we have your office very much to thank as well, you know, for investigating the murder of Fikile Ntshangase and demanding for accountability. So a huge thank you for that. I'll move on to Dr. Rowan Williams. Welcome, Dr. Williams. And I will ask you to speak on the moral courage and the need for us to defend the environment, and what can the international community do to support those who do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Simphiwe. It's a very great honor for me to be able to take part in this meeting this afternoon, and I must apologize that I shall have to leave promptly when I've finished speaking, as I have another seminar to go on to. But I was privileged to take part about a week ago in another online event with Malungelo as part of a consciousness-raising exercise sponsored by Global Witness along with Inspire Dialogue to try and draw attention to the risks faced by human rights defenders. And the story of Ntshangase was very much in our minds thanks to Malungelo's wonderful presentation on that occasion, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful to her for sharing what she did so candidly and painfully. But there are a couple of themes which I wanted to underline here in terms of the morality of the situation, the moral courage we need, and the moral perspective in which we approach this. And I would say that the most important thing I've learned in listening to stories about human rights defenders and the risks they run is that the climate crisis is not just one problem. It's not just an issue about our relation with the environment. It's about the deeply corrupting effect that our environmental habits have on our entire democratic system. We've already heard quite a lot today about the dysfunctionality of government, about state capture, about the corruption and erosion of democratic practice at every level, the lack of accountability, the culture of impunity. Into this poisonous world, environmental exploitation fits perfectly. It serves those anti-democratic purposes. And it seems to me that if we cannot learn to treat our environment in an ethical way, there is no hope of our treating one another ethically. These two issues go together. And I'm deeply encouraged and inspired by the way in which all panelists on this occasion have underlined that fact. So we're not looking at one problem. We're looking at an interlocking series of moral crises in our global political practice, which put democracy at risk and so put human well-being at risk. In our discussions leading up to the COP summit in a couple of weeks' time, I'm still really waiting to hear some of these issues being drawn together. And just speaking personally, one of the questions I shall want to foreground myself in public comment on the Glasgow summit will be this question of human rights defenders, because I see this as something which is part indeed of a global agenda. We've been reminded of the importance of the sanctions, formal and informal, that can be applied by proper due diligence procedures, by the public shaming of certain state actors for their inaction. And yet we also know how deeply the culture of impunity is rooted, how very hard it is to push back against what has been called the power of non-state actors, which Arnold so very effectively drew out for us earlier on this occasion. A second point I would want to draw out from what's been said so far is that we've seen how certain kinds of development, especially with extractive industries, can produce a breakdown in the cohesion of local communities, can unpick the bonds that unite people in local communities. And that's because some kinds of development, in inverted commas, promise quick wins, easy short-term and usually misleading results. The cost, both environmentally and humanly, is not foregrounded. But those short-term gains are attractive to government, to business, and often to certain individuals in local communities. If we're going to get around that particular problem, it's important that we have states, businesses, and local communities which understand the need for sustainable development. In other words, credible and moral alternatives to the quick fixes of the extractive industries in particular. So once again, we have to set the environmental question against a wider economic and social issue. How do we create sustainable forms of income, financial security, and social stability? Now, it's very tempting when we see how deeply interconnected these issues are to say, well, where do we start? But of course, the story we've heard about Fikile has reminded us that we start locally. We start with building up the resource, the security, the networking of local activism. Mary has given some very powerful suggestions about practical means here, connecting people, sharing information, making sure that people are not left exposed. That's crucial. But speaking from outside the situation, from the United Kingdom, speaking with something of a global perspective in mind, I think it's essential that allies of environmental defenders across the world strengthen their networks and strengthen their visibility. I said a moment ago that I'm rather disappointed, frankly, that in the run-up to the COP26 conference, we've heard so little about the vulnerability of environmental defenders. I hope that we in this country and elsewhere will take that to heart, will understand that the extraordinary moral courage of people who put themselves on the front line of protest needs to be resourced, needs to be backed internationally, not just by voluntary organizations, but also by states and interstate, international and intergovernmental organizations, which is why I was so glad to hear Mary Lawlor's perspective a moment ago. So, in short, it seems to me that we have a major question facing us globally about not just the environment as a self-contained issue, but about the way in which environmental corruption and degradation corrupts and degrades human society. We need to express, as we all have, enormous gratitude, awed gratitude, you might say, towards those who have risked their lives in this and who continue to risk their lives. We need to build better international coalitions and connections to raise the profile of these people who live at risk. And we need to keep in mind that our task is the creation of a sustainable and just society worldwide in which short-term profit will not be attractive in the way it now is, a short-term profit consistently and insanely subsidized by so many government agencies. Once again, I'm very privileged to be part of this conversation. I apologize for not being able to stay longer, but I've learned a great deal. I've been strengthened in resolve to think and speak about this, and I want to wish you my prayers and best regards for all that is done in this crucial area of discovering how we find the courage to move forward towards a more stable and less unjust world. Thank you, Simphiwe. Thank you for all to my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. We really appreciate your great contributions as to how we can move forward. And also just to also the amazing panelists, everyone, thank you so much. If anything, I think everyone really highlighted, the importance of, like the intersectionalities that exist in terms of protecting human rights defenders and also advocating for climate justice and a better society. We are still on time, which is great. And so I think I'll just move on to the question and answer session. So what I'll do is I've been noting questions that were asked by the participants. And the first one, it was asked by Sarah and to Kirsten. And Kirsten, Sarah is interested to know what do the intimidation tactics by the mining companies include? And how has your name been besmirched within the profession? And what would these people allege? So I'll give you 2 minutes to answer to that question, Kirsten. Thank you.
Sarah, the intimidation from in the legal sphere, so to speak, was an application that was brought against me in my personal capacity, where my professionalism was highly questioned. It was brought by a splinter group, so a group of the Mtejo members who had gone behind the scenes and signed an agreement with the mine to withdraw the court cases. Then this splinter group then brought an application against me, requesting that the court declare that I wasn't Mtejo's attorney and that I wasn't, and the court should withdraw the review application. So what ended up happening is that we had to stop the review hearing. The review hearing was supposed to be heard on this day, and we had to hear this particular application first, because obviously if they won, then the review application wouldn't get heard. But the content of that particular application was not ideal. It wasn't a pleasant experience to be on the receiving end of something so ugly. It was ugly because it was just 6 people and it was definitely not true. Obviously they lost because I'm still here and I'm still acting for Mtejo. So that was one of the things that happened. And other things that have happened are suggestions of violence on social media platforms. I've been threatened with being reported to the Law Society. I've been approached by so many people. I can't even remember how many now. Wanting to speak to me, to negotiate, to what are we going to do to withdraw the court cases? We'll make sure your costs are paid, but the court cases need to be dropped. Various individuals over the years, and yeah, it's nothing serious. It's nothing serious compared to what our clients go through, but it's not pleasant either. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kirsten. I'll just also quickly move on to the next question. Sorry about that. I'm just quickly. Okay, so this is just only a comment actually. So it's directed to Mary de Haas, and one of the participants also asked you if it's possible to share the report on the apartheid operatives influencing provincial governance, if that is possible. So it's just only a comment. And I just wanted to bring it to your attention. And then we have another question right now, I think that just came from Melissa Furry as well. And she's asking, how can we go about developing an early warning system that will allow us to intervene in settings where environmental defenders are at risk before violence occurs? I think this one I'll direct it to Arnold. And Arnold, I'll ask you to respond to that for 2 minutes.
So this is the question about the early warning system to allow for intervention. Yeah, there's no silver bullet. In this case, I think the strengthening of the social networks and of grassroots defenders and consistently getting involved in building their capacity to understand that they are human rights defenders and that there are mechanisms of support that are there at the national, regional, and international level, and the types of mechanisms that they get, and then also even bringing a greater awareness about the universal, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. I don't think there's been enough popularization or sensitization efforts that have been made to ensure that especially grassroots communities will come into contact with power in its multifaceted forms, non-state actors, the state, the local government authorities, the local police, who get woodwinked by investors that human rights and community defenders are obstructing employment of opportunities or investment opportunities, developmental opportunities. So the effect of those strategies, that there's the effect of dividing communities, means that the work that we do to make human rights activists, land rights activists, environmental activists aware of their rights is codified under the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders is absolutely key, because it is through that understanding that there can be greater resistance, but there can also be access to defense mechanisms, as well as to training around some of the things like risk management, digital security management, etc. So it's really those things that we need to do. Currently, we are too reactive in terms of the types of support we give beyond lawyers like Kirsten who work on a day-to-day basis with them. I think it will be important to ensure that there is proactive work that is done with grassroots defenders by people like yourselves, the network, and frontline defenders and others. Over.
Thank you so much, Arnold. And then I'll come over. I think I've noted the questions that have been asked right now, and then I'll just also come over to Mary Lola. Mary, there's a question from Nicholas, and he asks about the recent progress seen on getting ecocide formality recognized under the Rome Statute as very encouraging, and how well is defense of environmental defenders being incorporated in the proposed extent of the charge of ecocide? So would you be able to assist Nicholas in that regard? Oh, sorry, Mary, you muted.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat it?
Oh, okay, so he says the recent progress seen on getting ecocide formally recognized under the Rome Statute is very encouraging. How well is defense of environmental defenders being incorporated in the proposed extent of the charge of ecocide?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know is the answer. So I think you'll have to follow up with me afterwards, and maybe we can do some investigation. Sorry about that. I just don't know.
Okay, thank you so much, Mary, for that. Okay, and then the last one that I'll take is I'll hand it over to Mary de Haas. And the question, it was about, a few years ago that the Human Rights Commission held a national hearing on socio-economic challenges of mining affected communities in South Africa. And directives were issued to various government departments in South Africa to address the environmental and socio-economic challenges. And then at the time of writing, there has not been any status received of the compliance by the said departments of the directives. And so the question is whether or not the Human Rights Commission has the capacity or will to enforce non-compliance with human rights. And that question is from Mariette from Federation for a Sustainable Environment.
Yes, I think it's a very pertinent question. And yes, I think the Human Rights Commission, I have been deeply disappointed with them, quite frankly, even in terms of health issues where oncology people are killed and they've done nothing about the corruption. So that doesn't surprise me, but it's a systemic problem in South Africa. Getting anything, we have commission after commission, the Human Rights Commission does stuff, others do stuff, and nothing happens. And unfortunately, I mean, I've been doing this for over 30 years, and even the apartheid government showed a bit more shame when it was exposed internationally than this government does. Initially, we could get, for example, Amnesty International would write urgent actions and the government would feel a bit ashamed to do something about it. These people, the government we have now is beyond shame. I mean, it's across the board with human rights defenders, as Mary Lawlor will know, and the South African Human Rights Defenders Network will know, where you can't even give protection to someone, Thabiso Zulu, who's not, he'll do environmental as well as other corruption work. And I mean, not only do they not give him protection, and I mean, it's a case that's been taken up by the South African Human Rights Defenders and internationally, I think by Mary Lawlor. Not only will they not give him protection, but the minister's arm of the police and his crime intelligence people have almost killed Thabiso Zulu. They have seized his phones last week illegally and downloaded everything, exposing the lives of all the people who've contacted him. And this is our government. I can't tell the world how bad it is and how shameless it is and how it abuses those rights that are written into the Constitution. And that is why, and there was a mention of a report. I don't have a report. There was a leaked counterintelligence report in the paper that said there were, like the apartheid years, it was déjà vu for me, 30 years ago, hit squads in the police. Now there's hit squads in our crime intelligence operatives. Government's done nothing. The minister stays there because he's got the president exactly where he wants him. Our police minister has advisors from the apartheid forces, including a convicted drug dealer who was part of a chemical warfare program. So we're sitting with a minister of police like that, and the president refusing to do anything. Are you surprised that nothing is done to protect whistleblowers, whether they're environmental or community activists? And this is why we have to start uniting, not just among ourselves nationally, but internationally, to protect people and to fight for justice for them.
So much for that, Mary. And I think we have officially come to the end of our discussion. For some of the questions that we couldn't answer, I think Arnold also, he sent websites from like organizations such as Frontline Defenders, the Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Network, where people were asking for toolkits on protecting human rights defenders, for instance. And then I think someone also asked for a link on Mary Lawlor's recommendations that were made to the government. So I attached the official link as well to like her mandate that people can also use as well, just to refer further to her mandate. But like, thank you so much. I would like to thank All Rise firstly, like for, you know, hosting and like convening this important discussion. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for the work that you've been doing for the communities of Mtejo. And a huge thank you as well to all the panelists that joined us. And thank you very much, Mary Lola, for making the time to join us today and just remind us of, you know, why we should never forget about Fikile's name and her legacy as well. So to Arnold, to Louis, and to Mary Haas as well, thank you so much for all the important contributions that you also made in today's discussion. And hopefully next time we can have even like something longer and maybe in person just to discuss this, because it's a very important topic for us to move forward with. So thanks a lot. Again, I don't know, Kirsten, if you would like to just say a few remarks before we officially close.
Just a huge thank you. Thank you, Mary, for taking time out of your busy schedule to connect with us again. And thank you, Arnold, Mary Haas, Louis, Simphiwe, and all the people that joined today. We're so grateful. Tomorrow we'll be at Fikile's homestead for her memorial service. So yeah, 2 days of really, really important sharing and commemorating a wonderful woman. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yes, bye.
Everybody.